What can be the Christian response to these new discoveries, to this new image of Jesus the Jew? Well, there are two basic responses that one can observe. The first is that advocated by the great German theologian Rudolf Bultmann, who said that, okay, we know that Jesus of Nazareth as a historical figure didn't really see himself as God incarnate, but that doesn't matter because God himself is inspiring the church. The image of Jesus that was intended to be taken and to inspire the church and subsequent humanity was the image that has been traditionally read into the New Testament. And so, although the Jesus of history and the Christ of faith demonstrably are two different figures, it is the latter that we should be taking seriously as the basis for our Christology. And through this maneuver, which not everybody regards as particularly persuasive, he can actually justify the retention of the entire Chalcedonian and Pauline theology. The other response, of course, is to take the new discoveries seriously and to grasp the nettle and to say that the traditional Christian views about Jesus, the old Christology, was framed on the basis of information that we now know to be flawed. That modern New Testament scholarship, the Qumran discoveries, the Dead Sea Scrolls and so forth, no longer allow us as responsible objective historians to cling to the views developed by 3rd, 4th century Greek theologians who simply didn't have access to this material. Burton Mack is a distinguished American advocate of this thesis. So also is Professor Robert Eisenman, who recently published a book on James, the brother of Jesus. Eisenman's point in this huge 800-page tome is that the early Christian community divided into two, and that the brother of Jesus, James, is referred to in the Bible as the brother of the Lord, and Protestants certainly accept that Jesus did have brothers. Catholics don't because of their doctrine of the perpetual virginity of Mary. That the original disciples of Jesus and the early Jewish Christians remained in Jerusalem, continued to worship in the temple, and retained their loyalty to the Mosaic law. Whereas St. Paul, when he travelled out to the Jewish diaspora and eventually converted Gentiles as well, introduced Greek styles of religion, deified, divinized Jesus, and this was the reason for the tension which we know, even from the epistles of Paul, existed between him and the Jerusalem Christians. And Eisenman goes on to point out that in the year 70, when the temple was sacked and Jerusalem was razed to the ground, that the original Jewish Christian community in Jerusalem was more or less wiped out. Although we find people like the Ebionites in the 1st and 2nd century, and as late as the 5th century, who continued to believe that to be a Christian you had to be loyal to the Jewish law, as Jesus himself had taught. But following the destruction of the temple, the initiative in Christianity shifted to the new Gentile believers who rejected the law, didn't see the need for circumcision or the respect for the Jewish dietary laws and so forth, and that became the form of Christianity that eventually prevailed in history and was imposed by the Byzantine Empire. That's Eisenman's view. It's also upheld by somebody called Bernheim, who's a French scholar, who provoked quite a bit of controversy in Catholic circles in France a couple of years ago, and he produced a book also called James, the brother of Jesus, which makes the same point. And it's a very good case, and many Christian theologians are now figuring out what the correct response should be. Some, such as the British thinker John Hick, have said the old images of God and of the incarnation have to go. Clearly they are a historical product. Clearly it is illegitimate to project these Greek ideas back into the mouth of the very Jewish Jesus. We can retain Christianity, but we need to see the Trinity as some kind of symbol, poetic metaphor, rather than a realistic description of the divine nature. And John Hick, other theologians such as Don Cupid, and some Americans, to some extent somebody called Paul Nitter has been doing this as well, have been charting a post-Trinitarian Christology, which ties in, of course, with what the Unitarian movement has been saying for some years anyway. Now, I've talked about this in some detail because I think it is going to determine the tenor of Muslim-Christian relations in the decades to come. in the new millennium. And I think it's a very hopeful sign, because this great stumbling block between Muslims and Jews on the one hand, Christians on the other, namely the idea of the incarnation, which Muslims simply can't digest. God cannot inhere in anything he has created. He is outside the world, transcends the world. If that doctrine is jettisoned, if the Trinity is reformulated and regarded just as a poetic rather than a literal statement, well then there really isn't too much to divide Muslims and Christians, and a new era of understanding and dialogue can hopefully unfold.